Вітаю, з вами Катерина Соляр, і це проєкт «Рестарт». Це подкаст про раннє відновлення громад в Україні. Це історія про те, як прифронтові міста і села переходять від гуманітарної допомоги до системної відбудови. І ми тут будемо говорити про відновлення водоелектропостачання, про реконструкцію шкіл, лікарень, гуманітарне розмінування, про повернення людей до повсякденного життя. Насамперед ми будемо говорити про людей, які беруть відповідальність за своє життя і своє майбутнє. Подкаст створений в межах ініціативи «Ревайв», яку втілює програма розвитку ООН в Україні за фінансової підтримки уряду Кореї, щоб показати, що відбудова – це передусім те, що люди роблять заради людей. Сьогодні з нами Ауке Лотсмою, постійний представник ПРООН в Україні. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
ПРООН працює приблизно у 170 країнах і територіях, допомагаючи при цьому долати бідність, зменшувати нерівність, дискримінацію, також зміцнювати стійкість, щоб країни могли зберігати і примножувати свій прогрес. Як провідне агентство ООН з розвитку, ПРООН відіграє ключову роль у підтримці держав в їхньому шляху до досягнення цілей сталого розвитку. А сьогодні ми поспілкуємося, власне, про роль ПРООН у відновленні українських громад, які зазнали впливу війни. Пане Ауке, ви понад 30 років працюєте в складних і в кризових контекстах, 6 років в Ємені, 3 роки в Іраку, до цього також в різних країнах Африки, і тепер от Україна в розпал повномасштабної війни. Що привело вас у цю сферу? І після 3 десятиліть, що досі вас продовжує мотивувати?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. It's really a pleasure to be with you. And just to answer your question, maybe just to start off with a funny story, I actually started my work with the UN and UNDP in particular in 1994. So it's already more than 30 years ago. And at the time, I had a beautiful girlfriend who was moving to New York. And I was just finishing, my master's on economy. So I decided to move with her to New York. And just by coincidence, I got a very junior job with UNDP at the time. So 1994 is also the year of the Rwanda genocide. So I was then sent on behalf of UNDP to Kigali, to Rwanda, to work in the office there to deal with the aftermath of the genocide there. Of course, also a very terrible situation. So I was green as grass, but at the same time, it was for me a huge pleasure to be there, to see what impact we can do as United Nations and as UNDP. But I also felt in my heart, this is the kind of work I want to do. So since then, all my career I've been working, in Africa and later on also in the Middle East, in Yemen and Iraq before I came to Ukraine. And this is my profession. This is what I love to do. And this is what I'll continue to do until I eventually retire.
Ви приїхали до України в липні 25-го року як постійний представник, але вже працювали тут як старший радник з відновлення, тож мали розуміння і контексту війни, і, власне, контексту самої України. Дещо особисте питання. Ми тут, тому що ми не можемо інакше. Це наш дім. Ви ж певний час живете і працюєте в Києві разом з усіма, проживаєте повітряні тривоги, атаки і, якщо можна так сказати, робите це за вибором. Як ви з цим справляєтесь і чи навчилися ви за цей час чогось від українців і українок?
Well, I mean, maybe to start off with to say is that, the brutality of war anywhere in the world, but certainly also in Ukraine, you never get used to it, right? I think just the nature of war and combat has changed so much over the last 5 years, and I think the epicenter of this is actually happening, in Ukraine, and I'm particularly talking about, of course, drone warfare in particular, and of course we feel the brunt here in Kiev with nightly attacks, quite often. And initially, when you come here, it was also new to me. Despite my 30 years of experience, it was something completely different. And I think in the beginning, you're like, okay, I live in a house, by the way, without a shelter, So we were told to have a shelter, but that house doesn't have it. So after a while, I realized, it is probably safer to stay within the house and just, make sure that it's the safest place within the house itself. And the way I get by is also, at some point you get used to it very much, I would say. And sometimes it doesn't even wake me up anymore. That's not to be complacent, but I think I feel relatively safe in my place. And, I think what makes Ukrainians so resilient and so strong is really they go about business no matter what happens, in town. And now that the sun is out and the winter is over, you can also see life is coming back to the streets of Kiev, and people just get on with it, right? And I find it an amazing human quality despite all the adversity. I mean, after all, we had a very difficult winter, but the will to live and the will to succeed and the will to move forward of the Ukrainian people is something that I deeply admire.
ПРООН – це назва, яку багато хто чув в своєму житті, але мало людей чітко уявляють, чим, власне, займається організація, чим ви, власне, займаєтесь. Водночас ви очолюєте найбільший офіс ПРООН в світі. Сама організація працює тут вже понад 30 років, як ми вже сказали. І якщо хтось зупинить вас на вулиці у Києві і запитає, чим займається ПРООН в Україні, як ви зможете пояснити це простими словами?
Well, I think, after all, UNDP is a development organization, not a humanitarian organization as such, but we do important work even during the work. And you can sort of look at the range of activities. First of all, I think we are very active in the energy sector at the moment. So we're really helping the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Development and so on to help to restore, energy equipment that has been attacked, in various places of the country. So in other words, we also help to keep the heat on, keep the electricity on, keep the lights on in many places. So that's a very important piece of work we do. Number two, we are also the lead agency on what we call mine action, basically removing unexploded stuff, from the soil, and particularly in the frontline areas. So making it safe for farmers to grow wheat or sunflowers again, making it safe for people to pass, is also very important, I think. Thirdly, I think in general, we help with restoring infrastructure all over the country, but also particularly in the frontline communities. You can think about health facilities, educational facilities, administrative blocks, even sometimes high-rises that have been hit by drones or whatever. We support the local administration to cope with the impact of the war. And finally, I would also say, when it comes to, for example, economic life and people who are affected by it, be it displaced people, be it veterans, we also help them to, either reskill, gain jobs, seek employment, or help them to get employment, and so on and so forth. So it's really a broad-based support that we provide. And I think it's visible, all over the country, wherever we go. I mean, for example, we work very closely with the European Investment Bank. And together with them, we leveraged, I think, over 1 billion euro. It's not small money to really support local communities to rebuild damaged infrastructure.
А коли люди, власне, думають про міжнародну підтримку, вони зазвичай уявляють дві речі. По-перше, це гуманітарна допомога, яка надходить вантажівками до України, або оголошення від урядів різних держав про ту чи іншу фінансову допомогу, зазвичай це великі фінансові пакети підтримки. Роль ПРООН в цьому, як ми вже з'ясували, вона дещо інша. І як я вже сказала, оскільки ми так хочемо бути ближчими до людей, то я би попросила вас навести один приклад за останній рік, щось, що житель або жителька громади, яка зазнала впливу війни, могли би реально побачити, відчути або використовувати у повсякденному житті як ось цю зміну, яку принесло ПРООН?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. A while ago, I think 2 weeks ago, I was in Mykolaiv in the areas close to Kherson that were formerly occupied. And now you see that farmers are already getting ready to refarm their areas. And these are areas that have been cleared from mines and other rockets and what have you, and really see them already working on the land again is such a visible, such a visual in terms of people being able to go back to the land and rework. And I'm already sort of imagining those fields because it's mostly sunflower who grow there, to see them sort of waving in the wind is already something I'm looking forward to.
ПРООН працює тут з 93-го року, задовго до того, як світ почав приділяти Україні увагу. Як ця довготривала присутність організації в Україні допомогла розпочати краще відновлення, краще розуміння ситуації до повномасштабного вторгнення Росії в Україну в 2022 році. І що ПРООН змогла зробити завдяки цьому досвіду довгого перебування тут, та чого би не змогла, наприклад, зробити нова організація, яка би зайшла до України, яка працює з відновленням в умовах кризи.
It's true that UNDP has been in Ukraine for a very long time, even before 2014, as a matter of fact. Myself, I came to Ukraine first time around in 2014 for a short period of time. And I think both issues in terms of having worked here before, but also as an organization to be present on the ground for a long time is really important because it helps you to understand the country, right? And how it works, how it functions also at the local level. Because I think one thing it's important also for the listeners to this podcast to understand is, Ukraine is a functioning state. It has department, it has systems, it has ways to support people. It's not something that other people have to do on behalf of the government, right? So really, we see our job here is also to support, the government, both at the national and at the sub-national level, the local level, to support their own citizens. This is not something we have to do on behalf of government. So it's really about, supporting the government systems to make sure at the end of the day, the services that are required are delivered to the people who actually need it. And I've seen in many places where, for example, old people still reside in areas that were heavily shelled, but they're staying there because they get the required services eventually. Yes, we help to deliver those services, sometimes as simple as repairing the administrative block that is hosting those services. But at the end of the day, it's about supporting the government itself to be there for their citizens, even in the midst of a war. And having worked here for a long time, even before the war broke out, I think really helps us to understand, how we can do that in the best way possible. And that gives us a huge, I think, advantage to other organizations that have come in after the war actually, broke out, because it's also about the relationships you have with your partners in government, the local government that already exist a long time, So there's also a certain level of trust that exists between us as an organization and the government levels that we work with.
Уряд і громадянське суспільство часто використовують термін «раннє відновлення». Ми його в тому числі використовуємо в своїх подкастах. І він, в принципі, може означати різне в різних контекстах. Знову ж таки, якщо у вас запитають, що таке раннє відновлення, що це означає, якщо людина не чула цього терміну раніше, чому воно називається раннім, оскільки війна в Україні ще триває, і, знову ж таки, ми не знаємо, скільки вона ще буде тривати.
Well, I think it's important to understand that helping people recover doesn't necessarily mean that you have to wait for the war to end and then start, as such. So it's not a linear thing. So even when the war is still continuing and there is a big humanitarian situation, a recovery can still happen. And this is why we call, it early recovery, basically. So you start as soon as possible with helping people to recover and to rebuild their lives, even if it's in frontline communities, So, of course, it depends on the security situation also in many cases, but I think all over the country we are now currently engaged with communities on helping to rebuild their lives, both from terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of economy and in terms of, personal assistance sometimes as well. And that can't wait, because also you have to think about the fact that rebuilding doesn't necessarily also mean building what was there before. It can also mean, that you start already building something for the future. Ukraine has aspirations to become part of the European Union, for example. The European Union has many requirements in terms of standards and this and that. So it makes sense, whilst we're rebuilding already stuff, that it meets those requirements, so you don't actually have to do it twice. So that is also part of early recovery. So sometimes you build back better as opposed to what was there before. So I think in some ways, the sooner you can start with recovery, so we call early recovery, the better it is, because, then you can also deal with minimize the impact and help people to move forward as soon as they can.
Як ми вже сказали, війна все ще триває. І я думаю, що це питання ставили вам не один раз. Питання того, що Чи не можна почекати завершення війни і тоді вже займатися відбудовою?
I think the answer is quite simple. If you wait for the war to end, then nobody knows when the war will actually end. It may be too late. One has to, you'll have to be faster than that. And the fact is there are an enormous amount of people who are in need, who are either displaced or, impacted by the war one way or another. So I think waiting for a war to end is not an option. One has to, go in there and support as soon as you can with the means that we have. Of course, there are risks. There are risks of getting, injured in the course of the work. It can also risk for I was mentioning the example of rebuilding the energy infrastructure. There's also a risk for getting it destroyed again, right? We take these risks also into account and try to manage them as best as possible. So, for example, when it comes to these energy equipments, try to either put a drone netting or put, a huge cement structure to protect that equipment, so that at least, the risks of getting it destroyed again is much less than before. So there are ways of doing it, but I think, again, waiting for the war to end is not an option at this moment in time. And we've seen the impact of the winter is so harsh. I mean, imagine if we would have done nothing. It would have been really, disastrous, I think, for many parts of the population.
Її практично було б неможливо пережити, це однозначно. З лютого 22-го року ПРООН вивезла понад 1 мільйон тонн відходів, руйнувань, відновила сотні шкіл і лікарень, забезпечила мільйони людей доступом до електроенергії, води і соціальних послуг. І це такі суттєві показники, які відразу багато про що говорять. Але цифри, вони не завжди демонструють реальні зміни. Тому, якби я вас запитала, як ви визначаєте, що робота ПРООН справді змінює життя людей, що б ви мені відповіли?
Well, first of all, to say that I travel a lot inside Ukraine, and I see it always with my own eyes. And I'll just give you a few examples. A few weeks ago, I was in Kharkiv and working with injured veterans who were back from front lines, and now they were integrated into mine action operators, people who actually remove explosives from the soil, and they could still make themselves useful as an expert on explosives and mine action workers in general. The technical term is sappers, and I just saw how dignified they felt, and somebody who could still contribute to Ukraine, even with an injury. So it was amazing to see, how they sort of adapt themselves to their new roles after being in the trenches for quite a long time. Another example I can give is also, being in Zaporizhzhia, commissioning new generators, seeing, hot water flow through the system again, was also amazing to see, particularly since it is close by to a hospital that receives the energy and the hot water from there. And even the other day, as I mentioned before, I was in Permomaisk in Mykolaiv somewhere, and a lot of old people, pensioners, were still living there, getting the services again from an administrative block that we reconstructed, so that the local administration could work and provide those services to these people, so they could stay, receive their pension, and live there. Was also something that I saw close up, right? And I can give many examples of where that happens. And one thing is working in Kiev, but if you go to local communities, you can really see the impact all over the country of our work.
Ви очолювали офіси ПРООН в Іраку і в Ємені, те, що ми сказали вже на початку, під час активних конфліктів, і застосовували підхід раннього відновлення там, в обох цих контекстах. Якщо порівнювати ці країни з Україною, що є принципово іншим в підході до раннього відновлення тут у нас?
Well, it's something that I think makes Ukraine very unique. In that, first of all, by and large, the population is highly educated, right? Despite the fact that the workforce is less than it was used before, there is still, lots of people who are very qualified to work with. Number two, I would say that, the government, then the governing system, is still working very well. So therefore, it is really important to work with what is already there rather than, setting up parallel systems to deliver assistance to people. And I think in many ways that sets Ukraine apart. I think also the third component, I would say also, I have never seen a country like Ukraine where people are so determined to rebuild what was there before, but also to get on with their lives. When you talk to people in the community, they always say, this war will end one day and I'm going to plant my flowers and I'm going to rebuild my house and I'm going to, see my grandchildren and all of that. And I think that spirit, to survive, but also to continue to work towards improving their lives is something that you don't find everywhere, and I think it is hugely inspiring, even for somebody who's been doing this work already for 30 years, to see that, Ukrainians don't give up, they keep going. And that is really something that I think I value very much, but I think it's also something that helps us as, UNDP to really do our best as well, but also that's the best way also to help people.
Перш ніж почати будь-яку відбудову, відновлення, необхідно зрозуміти масштаби руйнування. І за останніми оцінками потреби у відбудові України становлять майже 588 мільярдів доларів. Ця цифра визначена і ПРООН, і Світовим банком, Європейським Союзом, урядом України. За кожною цифрою стоїть щось, що було в громаді до цього. Школа, лікарня, будинок, трансформатор, система водопостачання. Як ця цифра в 588 мільярдів доларів перетворюється на конкретні речі і на конкретні результати, на відновлену школу в Миколаєві, на систему водопостачання на Дніпропетровщині? Який шлях від цієї цифри до дії? І коли ми бачимо цю велику цифру, ми розуміємо, що там нібито відбувається якась відбудова, але це там крапля в морі. Чи немає такого відчуття, і ви розумієте, що це кожна дуже важлива подія в житті кожної громади?
Well, 588 billion is an enormous figure, right? Normally in other countries you work rather in millions than in billions, so that's also something that I think sets Ukraine apart. The scale of the damage is absolutely enormous, but it also, I think, has to do with the fact that, Ukraine was already a highly developed state in the first place, right? So the damages automatically also become huge as well. Now, I think what is important here is, you can't do nothing with a figure like that, right? You have to break it down by sector and say, okay, the energy sector, the damage is this, the water sector, the damage is that, the heating sector is the damage is this. And then within the sector, we break it further down in terms of geography, which places are the hardest hit or have received the most damage. Because at the end of the day, nobody has $588 billion in the pocket, right? This means that between the government of Ukraine, international systems, private sector, NGOs, everybody will have to work together to sort of to help to support and deal with this kind of destruction. Now, that also means the government will have to set priorities. You can't do everything at the same time, and we don't have money for everything. So within these sectors that you have broken it down into, then we see, okay, what are the priorities, or where we go first with what we have right now. And I think this is how to see it. This is how you end up fixing the hospital in Zaporizhzhia or building the underground education, the primary school in Zaporizhzhia, in the same place in Zaporizhzhia, it's like 7 meters deep as far as I know. So these are the things that we decide together, what is the priority, also depending on which country is donating money, for example. They have sometimes also their priorities, but this is how we get down to eventually the work on the ground and engaging in the communities that are considered to be of the highest priority, or even like in the winter season, how can we help Kiev to survive with all its high-rise buildings, such a harsh winter as the last one.
Ви сказали про те, що зараз треба утримувати увагу навколо України, тому що одночасно в світі відбуваються численні гуманітарні кризи, військові, кліматичні. Ресурси донорів, звісно ж, обмежені, їхня увага також. І як найвищий посадовець ПРООН в Україні, ви маєте постійно переконувати уряди інших держав надавати Україні, власне, пріоритет, максимальний пріоритет серед усіх можливих, звісно. Як вам вдається тримати цю увагу до України? І чи стало це складніше робити, враховуючи те, що повномасштабне вторгнення триває вже 5-й рік?
First of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's really hard to keep Ukraine on the top of the list. As you pointed out, there are other crises in the world as well that grab the headlines right now, particularly in the Middle East, for now at least. And that, in terms of the news cycle, it also puts Ukraine lower at that list. I think we're in the lucky circumstance that, particularly from European countries, there is still, I think, a very high interest in Ukraine. But I think I see it also as a job, as a task for UNDP also to help keep Ukraine, on the front burner as much as we can. So in terms of communications, advocacy, it's really important also that we produce the results of the work, that we can show that taxpayers' dollars, from countries that have sent their financial resources to Ukraine, that are well spent. It's not something just thrown away. And I think that responsibility we take very seriously, but also we do a lot of outreach to our donors to not only show what we do with the money, but also to advocate for support Ukraine in general, not only through UN agency or whatever, but really Ukraine's needs, deserves to be supported. And, the people need it, and therefore, we need to keep going. And the best way of doing this, of course, is also working with our partners like the government of Ukraine itself, but also others to find creative ways also, to showcase not only the impact of the war on Ukraine and Ukrainians, but also what we can do about it, to sort of keep also constituents who are usually also taxpayers, kind of convinced that it's worthwhile to support Ukraine. Because once that is sort of, getting less, then it also is more difficult for governments abroad to make that case also. That's why helping them to make that case, is also an important part of the job we have.
Я хочу ще поговорити про ініціативу «Ревайв». В червні 25-го року, за кілька тижнів до вашого приїзду, ПРООН разом із урядом Республіки Корея запустили цю глобальну ініціативу «Ревайв» не лише для України. Вона була запущена для громад Афганістану, Демократичної Республіки Конго, Гази і Сирії. І «Ревайв» має на меті охопити 3,5 мільйони людей в 6 країнах протягом року з фокусом на відновлення інфраструктури, створенні робочих місць, відновленні базових послуг. І це доволі амбітна мета, знову ж таки, в одних з найскладніших умов у світі. З 64 мільйонів доларів, які Корея виділила на «Ревайв» глобально, 14 мільйонів спрямовано саме на підтримку України. В наступних епізодах ми, звісно, будемо говорити в нашому подкасті «Рестарт» конкретні заходи в межах цієї ініціативи будемо розглядати. Але чи можете ви описати загальну картину того, що ця ініціатива робить в Україні і чому вона для нас важлива?
Absolutely. 14 million allocated to Ukraine by the government of Korea is something I think that we're very grateful for. I mean, it's a significant amount. And, together with Korea, we've identified Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk as the oblasts, as frontline communities as a sort of targeted areas for support. And I think it's important to look at it in a sense that based on our consultations, it's really important for us to support people in those communities who are ended up in a bad situation, in a humanitarian situation, but helping them to sort of go back to a normal life. And therefore, in these two oblasts, we're really focusing on both health and education, schools, let's say, facilities, to really create an enabling environment for people to be supported in the areas where they live, despite the fact that they're close to the front lines, close to the borders, and not necessarily the safest places in Ukraine, at the moment. This is exactly what this project is supposed to do, and what I can say is already that we see significant results on the ground. And also giving people motivation to stay in those areas and, that are their homes eventually. And, continue also with their lives.
Як я вже говорила, повернемося до роботи уряду України. Уряд Республіки Корея – частина ширшого портфоліо ПРООН в Україні, але найважливішим партнером все ж залишається саме уряд нашої країни, який одночасно працює в умовах війни, має реагувати на гуманітарну кризу і при цьому готуватися до вступу до Європейського Союзу. Як ви оцінюєте прогрес України і що це партнерство показало вам про здатність країни рухатися до євроінтеграції за таких доволі непростих, а можна навіть сказати, складних умов?
Myself, I'm actually from the Netherlands, so growing up back home, of course, I've seen, the benefits of being part of a wider European community from very close. And I think what is important to realize is also that the global goals that we aspire to as, the United Nations are also reflected basically in most of the requirements that the EU integration will demand, and that's from that perspective, we are also supporting the government very much in terms of being able to comply with some of the important chapters of the EU integration process that will have to be followed, and it goes from sort of the fundamentals such as governance and so on, but also something maybe one doesn't think so quickly about when it comes to a country at war. For example, in the area of environment, there are many requirements, as well that a country like Ukraine will have to comply with, right? And therefore, having progress along all these different chapters, is really important. And I think certainly for the future of Ukraine being part of a bigger economic bloc, stimulating the economy, import and export, but also, achieving energy security, for example, again, are going to be very important components. And therefore, for us also, we look at whatever project we do, we look at always what are the European and the EU aspects to this, and whether or not we can support that, so we can already move forward as we speak. It is similar to early recovery. Why do we have to wait? Do we have to wait for the war to end? Not necessarily. There are many things that can be done right now, and I believe there is a huge effort ongoing as a part of the government's priorities to actually get on that path. So again, from the UN's perspective, therefore, we share similar values, similar goals, and therefore also important for us to support.
Україна відбудовується, знову ж таки, під час повномасштабної війни, те, про що ми з вами говоримо, в масштабі якого раніше, власне, не було. І який один урок або конкретну практику, або інновацію з українського досвіду варто було би перейняти, наприклад, якимось міжнародним організаціям, які працюють в інших кризових місцях, країнах, ситуаціях?
I think we can all say that Ukraine is a world leader in innovation and digital transformation. It is really incredible what's online here and what you can do with it, right? And I think is making operations very efficient. And I think this is really something that Ukraine can also export, to the rest of the world. That knowledge, that capacity is really amazing. And I'm not talking only about drones per se, but more about the wider sort of approach to creating really a digital presence across, all parts of governance and also daily life. I mean, what you can do with Dia on your phone is already amazing compared to any other country. So imagine if we have this technology in other countries as well. I mean, that would be something I would be very strongly advocating for, because I think definitely cheaper, it's faster, and it's also, I think, eventually, when it comes to dealing with efficiency, very important for all of us. We're constantly under pressure to do more with less, and this is, I think, exactly what we would need to do exactly so.
В наступних епізодах ми почуємо історії сапера, який розміновує поля у Харківській області, лікарки, яка працює в прифронтових лікарнях під час обстрілів, соціальної працівниці, яка допомагає людям старшого віку і іншим вразливим групам населення, інженера, який відбудовує школи, місцевого посадовця, який одночасно при цьому теж займається розчищенням завалів і планує наше майбутнє. Ми віримо в те, що воно в нас буде і, звісно, найкраще. ПРООН є частиною всіх цих історій. Що їх, можна сказати, об'єднує і що насправді змінилося в громадах, де наразі працює ПРООН?
It's a great question, and I think what sets it apart, I think, is really the fact that we don't work on one sector alone, but usually when we go into an area, we connect these different areas of work and really try to have them also sort of work together in the best way possible. So it's not a one-dimensional approach. We call it the area-based recovery approach. I mean, other people call it differently, but the essence of it is that you look at the needs of a community as a whole and see how you can address them best in that particular area. So if mine action is the key priority, we'll start with that, obviously. But of course, when it comes to processing, for example, wheat or sunflower, whatever, that is also coming into the picture. Helping, the local administration to do a better job is another. Integrating veterans into the workforce is another. So we really look at it from a comprehensive point of view, and that really also, I think, connects the different beneficiaries within these communities in many facets of life. And it's really amazing to see how, these communities sort of start to flourish again once, the work gets going.
Ми з вами підійшли до швидких питань і швидких відповідей. Це відповіді одним реченням, те, що вам спадає на думку. Коли я вам скажу, наприклад, чого Україна навчила вас про людей або громади, що ви, не знали раніше.
Courage and determination.
Яка одна звичка або спосіб мислення допомагає вам залишатися ефективним в умовах високого тиску і невизначеності, тому що ми про це говорили весь подкаст.
My father, he's an old man now, but he taught me one thing. There is always a way. You just need to find it. And that's what I always keep telling myself, even when things are difficult.
І що є цією дрібницею, яка щоразу дає вам надію, що під час відряджень громадами в Україні, от ви в чому її вбачаєте?
It's just that no matter where you go, and I alluded to that a few times, is this incredible will of people to live, to move on, and just determined that nobody's going to get them down.
І ніхто не зможе здолати. Пане Ауке, я дякую вам за цю змістовну розмову, за ту щоденну роботу, яку ви разом з командою робите для українських громад, для України. Ваш досвід, він показує, що відновлення – це насамперед про людей, про їхню справжність, про їхню спроможність до дій, коли обставини залишаються складними. Якщо ми не можемо вплинути на обставини, ми просто змінюємося і адаптуємося до них. Мова не лише про об'єкти чи показники, як ми вже зрозуміли з нашої розмови, а про відчуття цієї опори, яке повертається до людей, коли вони бачать, що система працює, що громада тримається, що їхня праця важлива і має значення в даний момент. І саме цим, як ми вже зрозуміли, займається ПРООН в Україні, зміцнює основу, на якій знову ж таки відбудовується нормальне життя для мільйонів українців і українок. У наступних випусках «Рестарт» ми продовжимо говорити про відновлення, звісно, з представниками і представницями місцевої влади, з інженерами, соціальними працівниками, саперами, жителями і жительками громад, які щодня обирають відбудовувати своє майбутнє вже зараз, а не чекати на нього. Я дякую всім і кожному, залишайтеся з нами, слухайте «Рестарт» і до наступної зустрічі.